Time to go live with the news of the day. Remember, if you have any questions, just put them in the chat. So, the news of the day, if you have any questions, make sure you put them in the chat. Hopefully, I can get to your questions. Let's get started. The first bit of news is President Biden supports ceasefire and call with Netanyahu. So we've already looked at what's happening with Israeli and Hamas. And Biden supports ceasefire but encourages Israeli self-defense. Biden expressed his support for a ceasefire during a call with Israeli President Netanyahu. Despite this, Biden reiterated his support for Israel to defend against indiscriminate rocket attacks. It's really hard to see that the U.S. administration is not going to support Israel in this situation. I'm not saying that I pick any side in it, but it's pretty obvious that's what the U.S. is going to do. And of course, we have to accept that Biden is not at full capacity. And the result is that it's very difficult for Biden to lead the world towards peace here and make a strong demand that it's got to stop. That's one of the most difficult things right now. We don't need the violence in the Middle East. Now, early conflict resolution is possible, and we may see oil prices get calm after that. Biden's indefinite conclusion could mean that the conflict will not come to an end anytime soon. Like I say, I don't feel like Biden has come out that strong to say it's got to stop. Of course, it's keeping oil prices up, some of that uncertainty in the Middle East. But I'd say this is a real time for leadership, and I suspect that Biden is not going to provide great leadership at this point. Next story comes from the BBC, which is COVID. Taiwan orders toughest curbs amid infection spike. Remember that Taiwan has been one of the best in the world at containing COVID. But on Monday, Taiwan reported 333 local COVID cases, causing its stock exchange to slump by 3%. The government imposed its toughest restrictions so far, which is expected to last until the end of May. Of course, this could adversely affect global chip production because Taiwan manufactures half of the world's semiconductors. New restrictions could disrupt semiconductor production and worsen global chip shortage. Taiwan previously had done, a pretty good job with the pandemic. In fact, a pretty stellar job with the pandemic. And right now they're telling investors not to panic. Of course, that's the last thing you ever want to tell investors is don't panic, because that's when they usually panic. So that's a little bit of a risk there. But I know the market's been hit pretty hard in Taiwan. But with the healthcare system being very strong, them having control of their borders, I don't think that we're going to see any major outbreak. And remember also that obesity is a major cause or a major factor. And Taiwan is not an obese country compared to some of the others around the world. So I think that we're going to see that it won't be a huge issue. These are also cases. Remember, in the old days, I was just talking with my mother the other day, and when you went to the hospital and you had the remnants of a virus and you didn't have any symptoms, it meant that you were recovered and you were immune. No need to go to the hospital, no need to make a case out of it. You actually had built up exactly what the body's supposed to do, build up immunity. But now, if you went to the hospital or went somewhere to get a test, you have no symptoms, you're fine, and you're tested for, and you find out that you have COVID, they call that a case. In fact, it's an immunity. Well, of course, there's people saying, well, even if you get it, you can still spread it. It's very, very unlikely in the case of this virus. But that's what I would just say is the immune system is the most powerful system for fighting any virus or bacteria. And it's been operating for hundreds of thousands of years. So don't forget our immune system. Let's look at the next story. Here, Biden is saying he's going to send 20 million doses of U.S. authorized vaccines abroad for the first time. Well, my first response to this is 20 million is a tiny number of doses. So let's look at what he's talking about. Joe Biden desires to lead the world through global vaccine distribution. Biden states that the U.S. will be the arsenal of vaccines. We want to lead the world with our values, with the demonstration of our innovation, ingenuity, and the fundamental decency of American people. He plans to share 20 million doses. Again, that is a tiny, tiny number. So the U.S. could leverage this to increase their geopolitical power. I would say that they're competing against China, really, that has done a lot to distribute the vaccine. But also because America is getting closer to herd immunity. The CDC has just recently said if you got the vaccine, you don't need to wear a mask outside. That's pretty good, and I suspect we'll continue to see that grow. It's possible that America could get some support around the world if they could come to the rescue here, but I would say it's a little too little, a little too late. Next story is Reuters. BP, British Petroleum's lobbying for gas shows rifts over path to net zero emissions. Let's get real here, folks. Let's get real. It is not going to be easy to go to zero emissions or all renewable. There's a reason why oil continues to be our main source of fuel. Now, British Petroleum is lobbying the EU to allow natural gas. The EU plans to eliminate gas-powered energy plants as part of their aim to net zero CO2 emissions by 2050. That's a long way away. BP lobbied against the banning of natural gas and saying that it eases transition from coal. Natural gas emits 50% less CO2 than coal. Carbon capture could be a solution also to prevent CO2 emissions from entering the atmosphere by working with existing gas plants. So, carbon capture involves storing carbon emissions from existing CO2 emitters where it's transported and stored deep underground. Carbon capture market size could grow to $6 billion by 2027 as companies transition to renewables. Investors could invest in early-stage carbon capture projects or vertically integrated renewable energy companies. So here you have a petroleum company saying you need natural gas to transition from coal to renewables. Don't shoot yourself in the foot by banning the natural gas. And we'll see where things go with that. I think if one thing that our governments have shown us through this whole COVID crisis, they're now not afraid to do just about anything. So they could disrupt our lives by changing all that. Now, Financial Times, corporate bond downgrades by China rating agencies triple. This is an interesting story. 366 bonds in China were downgraded in the first 4 months of 2021 compared to a total of 109. Among these downgrades have been several high-profile defaults like China Fortune Land, and also Tsinghua Uni Group, which defaulted on $2 billion. This is an interesting story, and basically in this story, what you're going to see is that I'm going to be asking the question, should China intervene in the bond market and prevent it from collapsing the way the Fed did it, or should they let the bond market go? Well, let's think about that a little bit. So this could reveal a serious crack in the Chinese economy. If payment failures in China's bond market pile up, troubled companies could see banks trigger bankruptcy process. And I would expect the central government to support state-backed company bonds, but private sectors may be on their own. Or will they follow the Fed's intervention? Let's just talk about the Fed intervention. It was about a year ago when the bond market started to explode in America, when the crisis really hit from COVID. And what happened is yields started rising massively in the US bond market. And all of a sudden, you're seeing that the prices of bonds are collapsing as people are getting worried about defaults. So what did the Fed do? The Fed lied in a way that you are not allowed to lie. If you did what the Fed did, you'd be in serious trouble. If you know anything about Know Your Client, KYC, or anti-money laundering laws, the whole thing, that it's all about, listen carefully to this, it's all about who is the beneficial owner. As long as there's a beneficial owner, it doesn't matter how they're manipulating their funds through different companies, there's going to be seen as that beneficial owner. So in the old days, a person could take a lot of money and put it in another company and say, hey, it's not mine, it's that company's. But now we have to know our client. And once we see that that client is using other jurisdictions and other companies to put their money into different investments, then we have to say, no, you can't do that. And here you have the Fed. What did the Fed do? They gave the money to BlackRock and said, use this money to invest in the bond market to buy all these cheap bonds where the prices are collapsing right now, hold them, and then sell them eventually over time back into the market. And basically the Fed said, it wasn't us. We're not, because the Fed charter says they can't directly intervene into the market. So what do? They put the money with BlackRock to a special purpose vehicle with the idea that BlackRock would manage that money. And BlackRock managed that money, and the Fed said, we didn't invest. Well, you would have gotten into serious trouble if you had done that, if you were a bank or a financial institution. But hey, government makes the rules, so government can break the rules. Next one, U.S. Senate votes to open debate on China tech bill. So U.S. Senate voted 86-11 to open discussions on authorizing more than $110 billion for technology research in the next 5 years. Most of the money would be invested in the following areas of research: basic and advanced research in technology, research commercialization, technology education, and training programs in fields like AI. So senators are also working to include $52 billion for chips, as the bill will fortify weak spots in our economy's semiconductors. The U.S. agenda to expand the tech industry could make this a good investment opportunity for quantum computing, and also consider some companies like Atom Computing, NVIDIA, and IBM. So that's interesting. You know, when the whole globalization happened across the world, what happened is all the production went to China. And all of a sudden, America was left without production for many critical things. Now they're trying to rebuild that. I was just talking with a guy in America that is spending his time highlighting the companies, the manufacturing companies that are rebuilding manufacturing in America. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there. All right, let's see if we've got any questions here. First of all, I see the first one is, that's a big one. This is Shajala, says, I'm from Bangladesh and I stand with Palestine. Yes, definitely. I think not only, you know, on both sides, who wants to see war? Nobody wants to see that. The people don't want to see it. It's the governments that rev it up. So let's hope that governments can get smart. We need more leadership also from the U.S. to try to get this to stop. I'm totally against war. Robbie says, do you see Taiwan's GDP outlook this year to grow even further in 2021? Well, first of all, Taiwan was the only two countries in Asia that didn't fall in their GDP to negative. They were, I think, about 2% GDP compared to 4% in 2019. So there was some fall, but I suspect that Taiwan will probably do okay this year. This shutdown is a very temporary thing, I would expect, in Taiwan. All right, do you see Taiwan's, okay, next one. So, do you think vaccines will help to boost economic recovery? Yeah, I mean, definitely in America, they're talking about getting, I mean, there's hundreds of millions of people that have now have vaccines. If that doesn't take us to recovery, then we're really screwed because there's no way out. So, you know, you've either got two ways of overcoming this disease. Number one, vaccine, and number two, natural immunity that you build as you encounter any virus, bacteria, pathogen, or any dangerous subject. So, Titigon says, do you think government can help each others distribute vaccines to the world and stop spread before COVID mutates again? Well, you know, I just was watching an interesting YouTube channel where they were talking about all the number of mutations that are happening with this COVID virus. And they went back to prior COVID type viruses that have happened in the past, and they didn't have anywhere near all these mutations. And part of what this guy was talking about was the risk of bringing a vaccine out into a population right when a pandemic is going on, because what happens is it forces more variants to come up. And I found that was really, really fascinating. So we could, in trying to save ourselves with vaccine, we could be actually causing more destruction. There's some people that are even more negative on vaccines that say it could seriously damage your ability, your body's ability to fight off the virus. So when that mutant comes back, that mutation, you are going to have a less ability to fight it off, and you won't have a vaccine for it at that moment because we don't have vaccine for every variant. All right, Suchai says, what were the main reasons for the default in the bond markets in China? Well, I would say, you know, first of all, you got a very, very tough economic situation. I've seen now that, in China, we're trying to export some coffee machines for Coffee Works to get them over here, and we still have the supply of containers is very, very tight. That's just one of many things that's happening right now. But I would just say that you probably, look at the company that defaulted. It was a land company. I think that you probably have a lot of fear going on right now in China. But China is a huge country, and they actually maintain a positive GDP, the second country in Asia that maintained a positive GDP in 2020. All right. So Chris says, is it possible for governments to default, bonds to default? Well, that's a good question, Chris. And we've talked in the Valuation Masterclass about the risk-free rate. And what I've told you is that the risk-free rate is risk-free for the people in that country because the government can print that money to pay back that debt. Now, of course, if the government prints that money, what's going to happen to the value of that money? The value of that money is going to fall relative to goods and services that are in that economy or relative to other currencies. And so that brings me to the second point. Just because a bond is a government bond doesn't mean it's risk-free. What do I mean? If a person wanted to buy a Greek bond many years ago, let's say, or let's use a Thai bond as a difference because of the currency. Thailand has its own currency, and that's a Thai baht. Now, let's say that the Thai government started printing tons of money. What would happen to the currency? The currency would start to devalue. So their bond rate, let's say you could get a 3% 10-year bond rate in Thailand. And let's say that you're investing from, let's say, Korea, and you want to invest in that 3% bond rate. You've got to convert your Korean won into Thai baht. And when you convert it into Thai baht, then you can buy that Thai baht bond. Now, if the Thai baht depreciates relative to the Korean won, when you convert that money back to Korean won, you're going to have less of the money. So you may have gotten a 3% return for that bond, but you may have lost 5% in the value of the baht. So remember that when you're investing in overseas, outside of your own country, you're making two investments. Investment number one is in the underlying asset you're buying in that country, and investment number two is the currency. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I want to welcome Peter Lowe onto the show. Peter, great to see you. Now, I know Peter knows a heck of a lot about what's happening in Taiwan. Now, Peter asks, is it true that China companies listed in NASDAQ are not following US GAAP rules? That's a good question. I do think that there's been some sort of way that they've given them the ability to not follow US GAAP. But the truth is, I don't know the answer. But I do have some Valuation Masterclass Bootcamp students that probably could look into that tomorrow. And we could look at the US GAAP rules and NASDAQ and Chinese listings. So, yeah, what's up with the news on the US delisting Chinese companies? Is there any truth behind that? I think there is some truth behind it. Basically, what the US did is the US government, through the markets, New York Stock Exchange, the NASDAQ, basically they open a path for Chinese companies to come and list in America. But the problem that you have is how are American investors going to be protected about what type of fraud could be happening in Chinese companies in China? The auditors that are approved in America may not have access to all the numbers and everything in China. So there's been a big debate over that. And I believe that there's a push to try to delist some of those companies. But again, I'm not that up on that. So I think that's a subject for tomorrow for my students and myself. All right, next. What are some examples? Steve Eagle. What are some examples of industries that are pulling back manufacturing to America? Well, I think, first of all, what have we seen? We've seen vaccine development happening in America. We've seen face masks being made in America. We've seen medical supplies, and I think that medical supplies are probably one big one that's coming back to America. Also, you could see that other types of manufacturers related to planes, related to military, or whatever, could potentially come back to America. I would say that, the other things, jeans and clothes and stuff, I would say that's a little bit less critical. But I would say critical industries probably, Steve, could be coming back. All right, next question is there a possibility of the Israeli-Hamas conflict ending earlier? I hope so, but I don't have any way of knowing. I wish that Biden and his administration would stand up and demand a ceasefire. It doesn't matter to me what side you are on. I just hope that they would demand a ceasefire. U.S. has the power to enforce that or try to encourage that strongly. Another question is, does Palestine and Israel conflict have direct impact on oil? I would say not direct right now, but just flaring up tensions in the Middle East can cause people to be concerned. Also, right now, of course, America, I believe, is occupying, what is it, a third of the landmass of Syria and trying to control the oil in Syria. There's a lot of pressure there. There's a lot of pressure on Iran. And I would say that there is some serious risk of conflicts there. Suchai says, do you believe that U.S. will enter a scenario of hyperinflation? It's possible. I would say that capitalism moves pretty quickly, and you can get production capacity on board. So I wouldn't say hyperinflation right now. Also, hyperinflation would basically mean that the dollar is devaluing at a very rapid rate. But the US government has the ability to force everybody to transact in US dollars globally. And as long as they have that, that keeps demand for the US dollar strong. The other thing is that they have guns. And if people threaten their ability to control the financial system, they can try to respond. So I wouldn't say hyperinflation. I would say potentially stagflation. Stagflation meaning we have inflation, but low economic growth. I think that's possible. So inflation or stagflation. Peter Lowe, U.S. delisting Chinese companies equals the Chinese Communist Party behind them, and they're stealing IP, tech, big data from U.S., Europe. Yes, so obviously, if U.S. Government thinks that Chinese companies are stealing technology, then they're going to try to figure out a way to delist them or attack them. Yep. Ravi said, would delisted Chinese companies still be competitive against the U.S., UK, EU counterparts, or would this decrease competition? I think it would decrease competition, and I would say that the result of that is ultimately those companies will have to retreat to a certain extent from the U.S. The U.S. has got, the best funding, the best visibility. Like if you're listed on U.S. stock markets, you've got a lot of credibility. All right, Steve Eagle is back. The delisting activity caught my attention. Yeah, I think it's interesting. And Peter Lowe already mentioned the idea that, it's about potentially stealing tech. If that's happening, stealing IP. All right, Jenny, who's your ideal pick for the next GOP presidential candidate? And are you a fan of Joe's spending policy? My pick for the next leader is you, Jenny. I support you. Oh, that's right. You're in Thailand. So I guess I'll have to support you in Thailand. But in America, I think it's a tough call right now. And I wouldn't say that I particularly back anybody on the GOP side. I think that, unfortunately, to me, the GOP and the Democrat Party act the same on almost all the issues, except a small number where they fight. But when it comes to big government spending, wars, military-industrial complex, they're the same. So I don't see a lot of hope that even if the next person comes in, the GOP, that it's going to be a difference. All right, Steve says, do you think we are seeing the start of a trend where consumers and governments will have a stronger domestic focus in terms of trade and production, and we'll start to move away from China, Asia? I definitely think that, I don't know about Asia, but I would say China, yeah. But I think that, working with Vietnam and Thailand and other countries is still probably going to happen. So yes, I think that movement is already happening, but I would also say that that's not going to happen to an extreme unless we move into kind of a war situation, which I sure hope not. All right, that's it for the news of the day. Great to talk to you all. And pretty soon we're going to come up with the Uncovered Asia pick of the day. I'm going to bring that out in just a little bit, so I'll see you there.